In this round of the Friday Night Magic Standard event, I will be playing green-white tokens on the right against my opponent playing black-green Constrictor. My opponent opens the game with a Traverse the Ovenwald, getting a forest while I just have nothing on my first turn except for a tapped fortified village. My opponent opens the game with the first spell in the form of Grim Flare. I meet that with a 2-drop of my own in the form of Selfless Spirit. However, Liliana of the Last Hope shows her power against 1 toughness creatures, being right on time on turn 3, and my opponent crashes in for 2, triggering the ability of the Grim Flare. My opponent decides to rearrange all 3 cards and put none of them in the graveyard to help trigger the ability. I find Nissa on my turn 3, which seems like a good play on the curve, but against Liliana's +1, these tokens are not very long for this world. My opponent finds a Nissa of his own, and with Liliana plus his own Nissa, this game will be wrapped up in no time. I go digging with a Oath of Nissa, hopefully finding a good spell to cast for 3 mana to help mitigate my opponent's overwhelming board presence. I make another token hoping to stem the bleeding, but against the Liliana there's not much hope. No pun intended. I pass the turn with 3 open mana, potentially telegraphing a Stasis Snare. My opponent plays 2 spells in the second Grim Flare and a Walking Ballista on 1. My opponent attempts to minus the Nissa, put a +1/+1 counter on all the creatures. I respond to the Nissa trigger, however, not wanting the Ballista to have too many counters against my already problematic 1 toughness creatures. I cast the obvious Stasis Snare on the Walking Ballista while the ability's on the stack, only allowing him to shoot for 1 damage. My opponent decides to finish off my own Nissa and ships the turn. After playing a spell and already making a token with his Nissa, he decides to downtick the Liliana and finds a card trying to turn on his Grim Flares. Seeing that this is quite a bit of damage, I am obviously going to cast the obvious card in obviousness, which is Archangel Avacyn. Being indestructible, I decide to block the larger of the 2 Grim Flares, although it will still only absorb up to 4 damage anyway. Both Grim Flares will in fact trigger, giving him 2 looks at the top 3 of his cards and potentially increasing his graveyard size for more Liliana shenanigans. Being at 11 life, it was looking pretty grim, with also no pun intended, and I decided to take out the Liliana while I had the chance. I play a Selfless Spirit, threatening to flip the Avacyn at any time, and also play a Declaration in Stone, which was the perfect spell to have against his 2 Grim Flares, turning them into stone in the forms of clues. I decide to get greedy and pass the turn without sacrificing the Selfless Spirit on my turn. Having done so, I would have been able to take out his entire board plus his Nissa, but by doing so I give him extra mana, and he is able to play more spells and increase their toughness, which will reduce the number of cards I would be able to kill with the Avacyn flip trigger anyway. Seeing so much power on the board, I decided to go ahead and sacrifice my spirit at the end of the turn to try to flip my Avacyn, but my opponent had the Grasp of Darkness anyway, so it didn't end up mattering, and after drawing my cards, I saw that there was clearly no hope and I decided to scoop up my cards and discuss. In game 2, I decide to keep my 7-card hand on the play while my opponent takes a mulligan. My opponent decides to keep his 6-card hand and scry his card to the bottom. I begin with a turn 2 Selfless Spirit once again, while my opponent follows up with the signature card of the deck, Winding Constrictor. I crash in for 2 with the Selfless Spirit, and follow up with a second one. My opponent has turn 3 Liliana to take care of one of them, and crashes in with his own Winding Constrictor, trading 2 points of damage. I decide to play Gideon on 4 and immediately make an emblem to protect my 1 toughness creatures from Liliana's uptick. Still not wanting him to have the Planeswalker, I attack the Liliana for 3 damage, putting her to 1 loyalty. On 5 mana, I pass, representing Archangel Avacyn. My opponent plays Nissa after missing his 4th and 5th land drop, and decides to minus the Nissa while having Winding Constrictor in play. While this is a lot of power, Archangel Avacyn still is able to block with this indestructible ability. After blocking and killing the Grim Flare, my opponent passes the turn with no follow-up plays. Having my pick of which Planeswalker to kill, I decide to go after Nissa with it having its recursion to get back the other cards in the graveyard, and play a Servo Exhibition, which are actually going to be 2/2s thanks to Gideon's emblem. My opponent ticks up the Nissa, making a 0/1 plant token. He goes deep in the tank, still being stuck on 3 lands. My opponent decides to attack with the Winding Constrictor for 4 damage, threatening a potential removal spell. I decide just to chump block with the Servo token. With that, it triggers my Avacyn, allowing it to flip. I play a second Avacyn while the trigger's on the stack, but my opponent tries to play Into the Slaughter. With the second Avacyn on the stack, as well as the flip triggered ability from the previous Avacyn, I decided to sack my Servo token. In a confusing board state, my second Avacyn is going to be on the stack while my opponent responds with Into the Slaughter. I still have a second Servo token in play, and I am responding to my own Avacyn's flip triggered ability with 3 damage. It would have made the Servo token indestructible anyway, so the Into the Slaughter sacrifice ability does not take out either of the Avacyns. Having 12 flying power at this point, and my opponent still missing his 4th land drop, it's looking pretty grim from here. My opponent plays a Rishkar, upping the counters on both of them. A 6-powered attack is not quite lethal, bringing me down to 6 life. Showing a clear lethal attack of flyers, my opponent reveals a hand of 5 mana spells and scoops up his cards. My opponent begins by mulliganing to 6 while I keep my 7 cards. My opponent begins the game on turn 2 with a Traverse the Ovenwald. My first spell is White Dragon Fodder. I cast Oath of Gideon, swarming the board with a bunch of 1/1s, displaying the actual tokens of the green-white token list. My opponent casts Nissa and upticks to make the plant token. My opponent attacks in with the Grimflare, representing a removal spell for some bad combat math. Not wanting to fall for a trap, I decide to take the hit, which triggers the Grimflare's ability. My opponent decides to put a certain number of cards into the graveyard in order to help enable Delirium. With Delirium online, my opponent plays Traverse the Ovenwald, getting an Ishkana, making the game full of tokens. I cast Gideon on turn 4, and with his Oath he comes in with 5 counters, allowing me to immediately emblem and keep the Gideon around, doubling the amount of power of my tokens. I decide just to attack Nissa with one of the tokens. Bringing her down to 2 loyalty counters, I pass the turn. My opponent casts To the Slaughter on his turn, hitting one of the tokens in the Gideon. My opponent cashes in the Nissa for an Anthem effect and attacks with his Grim Flare. With only 2 cards in my opponent's hand, one being the Ishkana, I have to decide whether or not I think the chances are good that my opponent has a Fatal Push. Deciding the Grim Flare is too much of a problem, I decide to triple block. I play my own Nissa, taking her up to 5 thanks to the Oath of Gideon, and then I play a second Servo Exhibition, reflooding the board with plenty of 2 power tokens. My opponent plays the Ishkana, having Delirium getting his own small army of tokens. I have the mana and the available tokens to activate and transform my Westvale Abbey, but not wanting to lose it to another To the Slaughter, I decide not to go that route. I decide to take down the Nissa, showing how powerful these Anthem effects can be when you have several bodies on the board. I go all in, telegraphing the Archangel Avacyn, but hoping to prompt some good blocks. I flash in the Avacyn, maintaining all the power I have on the board. I pass with my life total at 18 to my opponent's 13. My opponent rolls up his Liliana on my Avacyn, bringing the power down to 3, and plays a Winding Constrictor to try to help catch up on the board. I drop a Selfless Spirit, again threatening to flip the Avacyn at any time, and roll down the Nissa again. With the 1/1s now averaging at 4/4s and having the Selfless Spirit, I send in all my creatures. Ishkana stalemates with Avacyn, and he chump blocks 3 other tokens with 3 of his tokens, taking 3 damage down to 10. He down ticks the Liliana, looking for any possible answer he can find. He passes the turn, and I cast a Stasis Snare on his instep to take out his Ishkana, threatening 10 flying power. My opponent's last card was To the Slaughter, but having many tokens and having exactly 10 flying power, my opponent scoops up his cards.